All right, students, we're back. You can tell because of the wardrobe change, of course. Chapter 5, Contracts, which starts on page 96 of your text. You're going to see first, of course, just as we've seen in the previous chapters, the initial hypothetical situation, in this case involving Miss Singh, who's with a company called Coasters. I'm going to advise you to read that carefully because, again, it will help to stage this chapter as well as the chapters that follow it. Introduction to contract law itself. We're going to be discussing, not just in this chapter, but in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, the aspects of contracts. Chapter 6 being forming contractual relations. Chapter 7, the terms of a contract. Chapter 8, non-enforcement of contracts. And finally, Chapter 9, termination and enforcement of contracts. This Chapter 5 is really just a quick, very quick intro into contracts themselves. You'll see the brief synopsis of the elements located on page 97. That involves an agreement that is complete, that it's deliberate, that it's voluntary, and that it's between two or more competent persons. Those are the core basic elements of every contract. Is there going to be an agreement? Is there going to be an offer? Is there going to be an acceptance? And is there going to be, as I mentioned in the intro to this chapter as well, is there going to be something called consideration? Is there going to be the proverbial, as we'll discuss in greater context later, or are we going to have the meeting of the minds? Is it complete? There has to be certainty. There has to, in order for there to be a contract, in order for there to be contractual obligations, there needs to be this notion of completeness, as well as the knowledge of what is required of each party in order to perform their side of the agreement adequately. Is it deliberate? Is it something that they intend to actually contract for? Is it voluntary? Is it freely chosen, not involving any type of coercion, any type of threats, any type of serious unfairness? And is it between two or more competent persons? You have to have people who are competent, obviously, in order to be able to form contracts. Oftentimes, and we'll discuss this in greater context in Chapter 8, when we deal with issues of legal capacity, you can't enter into a contract normally with a 5-year-old child. Are they competent in order to be able to make these judgments? Well, unless you have the extraordinary child, the proverbial, as we would say back in the 1980s, the Doogie Howser, the answer is probably no. So you need to have people who are competent to actually enter into the trial. You'll see, if we turn now to page 98, it talks about the necessity of mutual consideration. That's our intro to this notion of consideration. Both sides have to be able to get something out of the contractual relationship. And it has to be something that's tangible. All right? Not something that's intangible, that's not really there. If we have a contract right now to purchase my watch, all right? If we have a contract to purchase my watch, it's a nice watch. All right? And if the gentleman who's filming this right now were to say to me, I will give you 50 cents for this watch, does that constitute consideration? He definitely will be getting my watch. I will be getting 50 cents. Is that considered mutual and adequate consideration? And in all likelihood, no. This watch is valued at more than 50 cents. Is it, if I give it to him, is it consideration? The answer again is going to be no. That's simply a gift. It's not a contract. If I hold it out to him and I say, kidding, can he sue me for breach of contract? And the answer would be what? No. Please make sure when you're reviewing to read the case on page 99, Tal v. Ontario Lottery Corporation. This shows you what a typical legal brief would look like. And it's important because it gives you the facts, it gives you the legal question, and it gives you how the case was resolved. Or the rationale for the court's decision in that case that determines whether or not there is a contract in that case. We look now on page 101 to the legal factors in the business context creating the contract. There has to be communication. In order for there to be an offer, you have to communicate that offer. In order for there to be an acceptance of an offer, you also have to communicate the acceptance. Absent that type of communication, whether it's in oral form, spoken word, whether it's in written form, whether it's through actual letter, or whether it's through email, and any type of electronic indication, that type of communication, something needs to be communicated between one party and the other party or parties. We talk about on 102, what is the standard for determining the existence of a contract? It's an objective one. And you'll see what the objective test is. It's based upon what a reasonable person would think in that situation. Now, what is the reasonable person? We haven't really discussed that at all thus far. The reasonable person is no person. It's not you. It's not the person who's your best friend. It's not the person who's standing on the street corner waiting for a bus. It's not me. A reasonable person is a legal fiction. We take what most members of society would actually think in those terms, in that given situation, and looking at it in the sense of what would happen in a normal situation, and we come up with this notion of a reasonable person. It is an objective test as opposed to a subjective test. We're not asking what you, the person entering into the contract, would have subjectively believed. Instead, the reasonable person test is designed to provide you with the typical situation. Get out of whether or not it's your opinion or the person's opinion who's actually entered into the transaction, because we've got to take it outside of that. Otherwise, we might not be able to actually resolve what is reasonably expected of a particular contract and whether or not there was actual communication. Something else that we discussed beyond that, again on page 102, is the notion of bargaining power. Are we dealing with people who are coming at this with equal bargaining power? Do they have the same resources? Do they have the same knowledge in order to be able to bargain effectively with the other side? It's something that we look toward in contract law, because you may have the contractor who's building somebody's roof, and then you may have the 94-year-old citizen who has never really contracted for anything in his or her life and would not have an adequate understanding of what a reasonable value would be in order to construct a roof. In this hypothetical that I'm giving you, if the roofer is saying it's going to cost $50,000 to construct a normal shingle roof for a standard-sized home, one-story home, then that would arguably be an exorbitant and excessive amount. If the elderly person who's bargaining with that contractor ultimately does not pay the full amount, can the contractor reasonably enforce that contract? What the court would look toward is whether a reasonable person would have paid, number one, and whether or not both sides would have been coming at each other with equal bargaining power. The next thing we deal with on page 103 is dealing with business relationships themselves in performing or enforcing contracts. And on page 104, please read the issues with regard to economic realities and economic styled breaches. You'll notice on the bottom of page 104 with regard to economic breaches. An economic breach defines it. An economic breach occurs when one party calculates that it is more financially rewarding to breach the contract in question than to perform it. And it gives you an example. And there are obviously situations where the economic reality comes into play. I gave you an example in a previous chapter. Remember that case about the Pinto? The Ford Pinto? Well, the Ford Pinto, in that case, the Ford Motor Company made an economic decision. Economic reality said it was better to allow for its cars to explode and to pay out settlements in court for the families or the victims of those tragedies than to actually do the right thing and adhere to the contract it had with its customers and actually making a car that doesn't explode. Reputation management also comes into play on page 105. Of course, especially in the internet age, you're going to have to consider, as somebody who runs a business or works within a business, how your reputation can come into play. In the internet age, of course, say you're running a restaurant. If you refuse to give the customer his or her refund back, and that is a contractual relationship, you're providing food, they're paying you money. If the customer is dissatisfied with the quality of the food or the quality of the service, do you refund the client the money? This is called reputation management. If you give the customer back his or her money, they may not come back, but at the very least they're not going to badmouth you down the road. They're not going to go on to Yelp and issue you a negative review, which thousands of people are going to see and maybe steer business away from you. This is considered reputation management, and it goes well beyond just that one instance. So that's what we're going to be discussing in the coming chapters. You'll see briefly the questions for your review, questions for critical thinking, and there is going to at least be a brief situation that you're going to have to address as part of an assignment. And from here we'll go to chapter 6. Thanks.